Alexander Whitmore screamed while banging on his $4's steering wheel. Bugatti Chiron support, $8 million. The most expensive car in the world turned into a dead weight in the midst of the busiest street in Manhattan, and blue smoke blasted from the engine. The millionaire software entrepreneur had precisely 45 minutes to arrive to the meeting that would determine the course of his business. Canceling would result in the loss of $300 million in finance, and the Japanese investors would not wait a moment past the scheduled deadline. "Can I assist you with that, sir?" said a calm voice behind him. Alexander turned abruptly and saw a black man in his 40s, wearing worn clothes, unshaven, holding a plastic bag with his belongings. His eyes, however, had something Alexander couldn't quite figure out, a penetrating intelligence that contrasted with her appearance. Really? And what exactly does he know about a quad-turbo W16 engine? Alexander laughed icily and cruelly. Thomas Johnson stood motionless, watching the smoke from the coloring pattern and the frequency of the thermal oscillations. "I'd say it's a fault in the intercooler cooling system. Probably the temperature sensor in Block 3 is sending incorrect data to the ECU." The smile died on Alexander's lips. Those weren't words a homeless man should know. "Listen here," Alexander began, but Thomas gently interrupted him. "You have approximately 8 minutes before the engine goes into permanent thermal protection. After that, even Bugatti won't be able to repair the damage. His car will become a very expensive $5 million sculpture." A small crowd began to form. People with cell phones filming, executives whispering, tourists pointing. Alexander felt cold sweat of panic running down her back. Her reputation, her company, everything depended on arriving at that meeting on time. "I really can fix this," Thomas continued, her tone disconcerting. Alexander glanced at the man in front of his watch, then at his watch, and last at the smoke, still emanating from the engine. "But I need you to trust her." 43 minutes. Her brain worked frantically. It would take an hour for a tow truck. It was 2 hours before an official mechanic arrived. In gridlock in Manhattan, an Uber would not be feasible. "You have half an hour to persuade me," Alexander snarled. Prior to calling security, Thomas's eyes gleamed with something Alexander couldn't quite place, and he nodded calmly, as though he had anticipated that exact reaction. It was the calm assurance of someone who already knew how this story would end, not the despair of someone who had to prove something. "Mister," using the name that had never been mentioned, Thomas said, "Ego, we've already met. You ought to know my work, and at least I am familiar with hers." What Alexander couldn't imagine was that this seemingly desperate man held secrets that would transform not only his day, but his entire view of intelligence, value, and the people he had learned to dismiss with a simple look of contempt. If this story of humiliation and twists and turns is moving you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to discover about this beggar will completely change the way you see the people around his forever. Alexander studied Thomas with the calculating gaze of someone who had built an empire by assessing people in seconds. "How do you know my name? I didn't tell you who I am." "It's stamped on the side of your car," Thomas replied simply, pointing to the small personalized plate that read a Whitmore CEO Nexus Tech, and his picture was on the cover of Forbes. 3 weeks ago, the young billionaire who revolutionized artificial intelligence. Alexander relaxed slightly, but her expression remained suspicious. "And I suppose you read the article at the public library?" "Actually, I read it on my tablet, sitting at the Starbucks on the corner," Thomas corrected calmly, "same place where I read his shareholder communications every Friday." The answer caught Alexander off guard. Beggars didn't have tablets. They didn't subscribe to financial magazines. They didn't hang out at Starbucks to read about the stock market. "Look, I don't know what his game is here," Alexander said, her patience wearing thin. "But I have a meeting worth $300 million, and you're wasting my time with this charade, acting." Thomas repeated her voice, maintaining that irritating calm. "Mr. Whitmore, his intercooler is overheating because the secondary circuit circulation pump has seized up. It's a known defect in the limited edition Chiron support. Bugatti issued an internal technical bulletin about it last March. Alexander swallowed hard. That information wasn't public. Not even his personal mechanic knew those specific technical details. How the hell do you know about an internal Bugatti bulletin? Alexander demanded, her voice rising an octave. Thomas tilted his head slightly. The same way I know that you cancelled your premium insurance policy last month to save $50,000 a year, or that your company lost the Samsung contract because of a 3-day delay in delivering the prototype. You're an industrial spy, Alexander concluded, her hand automatically reaching for her mobile phone. You're recording our conversation. The blood drained from Alexander's cheeks. Only he and his CFO knew this information, which was secret. The competition employs you. Thomas sighed deeply, like a teacher losing patience with a particularly slow student. Mr. Whitmore, do you think I would be on the street offering to service his car for free if I were a spy? Or wouldn't it make more sense for me to merely record his engine melting and use that footage as future blackmail? There was no doubting the logic, but Alexander was in a panic. He had 40 minutes to get to his meeting. This stranger knew personal information about him that even his own wife was unaware of, and the crowd was gathering. Alexander's voice was now filled with a mix of sick interest and horror as he queried, "Who are you?" His name is Thomas Johnson. He has a degree in mechanical engineering from MIT and a PhD in advanced thermal systems from Stanford. He worked for 5 years at NASA, developing cooling systems for spacecraft, 2 years at Bugatti as a technical consultant, and 3 years on the streets of Manhattan learning that intelligence without a fixed address is absolutely worthless. Alexander was silent for a moment, processing the information. MIT, Stanford, NASA, he repeated slowly. If all that is true, how did you end up like this? Thomas smiled for the first time, but there was no humor in his expression. Like what? Mr. Whitmore, you name it. Black, poor, dirty, undesirable. Use whatever term first came to mind when you saw him. Alexander looked away, uncomfortable with the accuracy of the observation. I didn't mean, of course, you did. Thomas interrupted her gently. And you know what the most ironic part of all this is? 3 years ago, when I was still Dr. Thomas Johnson, senior technical consultant, you sent me a personal invitation to speak at his annual innovation event. You offered $50,000 for a 2-hour presentation on the future of thermal systems in technology. Alexander frowned, trying to remember. I sent out hundreds of those invitations. April 15, 2021, Thomas continued relentlessly. I was scheduled to speak right after you on the program. The same day, my life completely fell apart. 3 fouls say accusations of plagiarism, a fraudulent investigation, and a legal system that decided that a black man who was too successful must be cheating somehow. The charges were dropped 6 months later when they discovered I had been the victim of corporate sabotage. But you know how his tech world is. Scandal travels at the speed of light. Truth crawls at the speed of a dying turtle. The smoke from Alexander's engine had subsided slightly, but the electronic diagnosis now showed a countdown. 37 minutes to permanent damage. If you are in fact who he says he is, Alexander began hesitantly. Then can you really fix this? I can fix it in 15 minutes with the right tools. But first, I need you to answer me one question, honestly. If I was still wearing his $3,000 suit and arrived here in a Tesla, would you hesitate for even a second to accept his help? Alexander opened his mouth to lie, then closed it again. Thomas nodded slowly and replied, "That's what I thought." The answer was evident on his embarrassed face. Well, Mr. Whitmore, today you're going to learn a valuable lesson about judging books by their covers, because the same brilliant mind that designed the systems you use in his most advanced products is right here in front of her. Hidden under worn clothes and a few months without visiting an expensive barber. Alexander checked his watch again. 35 minutes. Her billion-dollar meeting was 35 minutes away, and her only hope of salvation lay in the hands of a man he had judged and dismissed in less than 10 seconds. What do you want in return? Alexander finally gave in and asked, "I want you to sit there on the sidewalk and watch a beggar save your $1 million empire. Then, when I'm done, I want you to think about how many other Thomas Johnsons you've dismissed throughout your life simply because they didn't fit her limited definition of success." Thomas looked him in the eye, and Alexander saw something there that made him shudder, not greed, desperation, or even anger, but something much more dangerous. The complete calm of someone who had had a plan for a long time and had finally found the ideal opportunity to carry it out. Alexander was sitting on a filthy Manhattan curb, watching a homeless man open the hood of his $4.8 million Bugatti. The irony did not go unnoticed by passers-by who stopped to film with their cell phones, Alexander said. 32 minutes, Alexander muttered, obsessively checking his Rolex. The crowd had grown to over 100 people, turning his personal emergency into a public spectacle. Thomas worked with precise economical movements, her hands navigating the complex engine as if it were a familiar map. "The diagnostic system is lying to you," he explained without looking up. "It shows a general intercooler failure, but the real problem is my—" "What do you mean lying?" Alexander asked, genuinely intrigued despite his anxiety. Bugatti engineers program the system to overdiagnose simple problems. It forces owners to use only authorized services which charge $50,000 for repairs that cost $500. Thomas disconnected a specific cable and immediately the engine alarm fell silent. "There, now we can work on the real problem." Alexander watched, fascinated, as Thomas removed components with the confidence of someone who had designed similar systems. "Did you really work at NASA? 5 years on the Mars exploration program. My cooling systems are flying through space right now." Thomas smiled slightly. Of course, his name was removed from the official credits after the incident. What kind of incident completely destroys a career like her? Thomas paused his work, looking directly at Alexander. The kind that happens when a black engineer questions safety decisions made by white executives. When you're right, but you don't have the social pedigree to be right. The answer hit Alexander like a punch. He remembered how many times she had dismissed suggestions from employees who didn't fit her company's cultural profile. Specifically, "I questioned the decision to rush the launch of a military satellite, ignoring my warnings about thermal failure." Thomas continued working as he spoke. 3 months later, $200 million exploded in the atmosphere, just as I had predicted. "But who do you think was his who?" Alexander replied, feeling a growing weight in his stomach. "Bingo," said the haughty young guy who made needless trouble and showed no regard for authority. Thomas took out a little fragment of the engine and examined it in the light. "Here's his villain, a manufacturing defect in the thermal sensor. Market value, $8. Repair costs $47,000. Alexander choked up. "And how did you become homeless?" 8 months were spent on the investigation. Because of the ongoing federal inquiry, no employer would hire him during that time. He had spent all of his savings on lawyers. The foreclosure of his apartment occurred. He learned something intriguing about the American labor market after being found not guilty at all. Alexander hadn't noticed it before, but Thomas started putting in a new part he had grabbed from a tiny tool bag. "What did you find?" That vindication is not acquittal. Because the truth does not spread as quickly as her reputation does. That, even with an MIT PhD, you lose your corporate identity when you lose your address, phone number, and bank account. The audience had gathered in a polite circle, with several people recording in silence. Although he was recognized by a few whispers, Alexander observed that his remarks were different from the normal praise she received. 3 years on the streets taught me things that 5 college degrees could never teach, Thomas continued, her hands working with surgical precision. They taught her to observe, to truly see people, to understand systems of power from a perspective that executives like you will never have. 17 times I've been at the Starbucks where you hold your informal meetings. I've sat on the park benches, where he walks and talks on the phone with investors. I've slept outside the dry cleaners where he drops off his expensive suits. Thomas smiled enigmatically. You never saw him, of course. People like him are street furniture to people like you. A chill ran down Alexander's spine. Were you watching him? I was watching the system, studying how real power works in this city. Thomas reconnected the last cable and closed the access panel. And I developed some interesting theories about structural vulnerabilities in seemingly solid empires. Alexander checked his watch again. 28 minutes. Is the engine running? Start. The car. Alexander obeyed, and the Bugatti purred perfectly. No smoke. No alarms. The crowd applauded spontaneously. Impossible, Alexander murmured. How did you fix in 20 minutes something the Bugatti itself said would take days? Real motivation. He fixes cars for money, and I just fixed his car for something much more valuable. Alexander felt another chill. What would that be? Access. Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth and said, and because I have something they don't. He leaned in and spoke softly, just loud enough for Alexander to hear. Before Alexander could ask what that meant, Thomas walked into the crowd and said loudly, Folks, our friend here needs to get to a very important meeting. How about we let him go and give him some room? People began to disperse. But many continued to film discreetly. Alexander realized that this entire situation had been documented by dozens of cell phone cameras. Thomas called, still perplexed. Thomas turned back with that mysterious smile once more. What do I owe you mean by access? He asked. The interesting part starts when you get to your meeting and realize that Japanese investors have already seen the videos that are being posted right now. Mr. Whitmore, you'll find out in the next half hour that fixing his car was the easiest part of his plan. Alexander checked his phone and noticed that social media notifications had already appeared. Videos showed him sitting on the pavement, while a homeless man fixed his car worth $1 billion quickly went viral. Alexander comprehended. You planned this. Her voice a mixture of respect and increasing worry. Thomas started to leave after saying, I planned it for 3 years. Every detail, every variable. Good luck at your meeting, Mr. Whitmore. Something tells me it will be even more interesting than you imagine. As Thomas vanished into the Manhattan crowd, Alexander stood beside his flawlessly operating Bugatti, slowly realizing that he had been a part of a much larger game that he had not even begun to comprehend. The man he had assumed to be a desperate beggar had just shown that he possessed not only technical genius, but also a sophisticated strategy that was just starting to come to fruity. Alexander was about to learn that revenge, when carried out by a truly brilliant mind, could be a devastatingly beautiful work of art. He arrived at the Four Seasons Hotel 23 minutes late, his footsteps echoing across the polished marble. As he hurried toward the meeting room, still processing the bizarre events of the previous 2 hours, the Japanese investors are a little agitated. Agitated how? Alexander asked, adjusting his tie as he walked. They've seen the videos. Alexander stopped abruptly. What videos? James asked. He hesitated, and then showed him his tablet. The screen showed a TikTok video with 2.3 million views, entitled Arrogant Billionaire. Humiliated by homeless genius. In the hallway, Mr. Whitmore called her personal assistant James. You'll be shocked at the conclusion. Alexander watched in silent horror as he saw himself treating Thomas with contempt, being corrected about his own car, and finally sitting on the sidewalk, like a shamefaced child, while the beggar demonstrated superior technical knowledge. 3 million, Alexander muttered. Incredulous and growing rapidly, James confirmed nervously. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, it's on every platform. #billionaire humbled is trending. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the magnitude of the disaster. Her carefully constructed image as a visionary entrepreneur was being demolished in real time by millions of people who now saw her as an arrogant, prejudiced elitist. Did the Japanese say anything specific? Yamamoto-san mentioned that they were disappointed with the lack of humility and wisdom demonstrated in the videos. They said it does not reflect the values they look for in business partners. Alexander pushed open the doors to the meeting room and immediately felt the chill in the air. The 5 Japanese executives who normally stood respectfully when he entered remained seated, her expressions carefully neutral. "Yamamoto-san, I apologize for being late," Alexander began, but was cut off by a polite but firm gesture. "Whitmore," said the group's leader in impeccable English. "We watched his videos this morning with great interest. Very enlightening." Alexander's embarrassment deepened when he noticed that everyone present had their phones discreetly positioned, probably still following the comments and shares of the viral videos. "That was a misunderstanding," Alexander tried to explain. "The man approached me, and you judged him by his appearance," interrupted another Japanese executive. "You deem me," said her expertise without listening. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of Western arrogance we have been working to avoid in our partners." Alexander felt the ground opening up beneath his feet. $300 million in investments were slipping through his fingers because of a 40-minute encounter with a homeless man. "Please, let me explain," he began desperately. Yamamoto raised her hand again. "There's no need, Whitmore-san. Her true nature has been clearly revealed. We are canceling our participation in the investment. We will seek partners who demonstrate the values we respect." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander watched helplessly as the executives rose in unison and headed for the exit, leaving him alone in the hall that should have witnessed his greatest business triumph. James approached hesitantly. "Sir, there's more." "More, what?" Alexander asked, her voice coming out more like a groan. "CNN is wanting an interview, and Forbes has canned the cover story on you for next month. They said they want to reevaluate the angle of the story after today's events." Alexander slumped into a chair, finally understanding the extent of Thomas's plan. It hadn't been a chance encounter. Every move had been calculated, every word carefully chosen to maximize his public humiliation. His phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Alexander," said Thomas's familiar, calm voice, "I imagine her meeting didn't go exactly as planned." Without a question, Alexander said, "You planned all this." "I studied his patterns, his work route, and his weaknesses for 3 years. I was aware that I would eventually have the ideal chance to show her true self." Alexander surveyed the deserted hall, trying to comprehend the extent of his loss. "Why? She wasn't even someone I knew." Thomas chuckled quietly. "But Alexander, I knew you. I have known men like you, who use people like me to construct empires and then throw us away when we are no longer useful to him. You discovered today that human worth and intelligence are independent of addresses and bank balances." "You ruined me," Alexander said. Thomas said, "I just recorded you being who you are." She was responsible for the devastation. Every disparaging remark, patronizing glance, and biased assessment was his own. Alexander knew Thomas was correct, so he said nothing. "Alexander, this is where things become interesting." With a tone that was almost professorial, Thomas proceeded. "This was only the initial action. Men who believe they can walk all over others and get away with it have no idea what I have in store for them." Alexander was left alone with the sound of his own pulse pounding and the mounting knowledge that his public humiliation had just been the appetizer to a banquet of consequences. He hadn't even started to envisage when the phone ended. A horrifying question kept repeating in her head as the tapes went viral and hateful remarks about her conceit grew in number on social media. What else had Thomas Johnson prepared for the guy who had deemed her unworthy of even the most basic respect if he had planned all of this 3 years beforehand? Alexander Whitmore sat in the office he had formerly dominated like an emperor 6 months later, which was now a communal area on the 22nd floor of a typical office building. 3 months after the Bugatti incident, which the media labeled her viral humiliation, Nexus Tech had filed for bankruptcy. The videos continued to circulate. With 42 million views overall, Alexander became a worldwide representation of corporate haughtiness. When Prejudice Destroys Empires was a case study written by Harvard Business School regarding her demise. Alexander unwillingly answered the phone when her new assistant, Mr. Whitmore, said, You have a call. Shortly after investors left his business en masse, her ex-husband had filed for divorce. The alimony documents must be signed by you. Additionally, Alexander, I learned about Thomas Johnson's passing today. Alexander took a deep breath. What's new? He was appointed Space Tech Industries principal engineer. Wage of $2 million annually, including profit sharing. According to CNN, he created a groundbreaking propulsion system that will cut space travel expenses by 70%. After hanging up, Alexander instantly looked up the news online. On the same show where Alexander had once been hailed as a visionary, there was Thomas, now dressed in a perfect suit, being interviewed. But there was a noticeable difference. Thomas talked about leveraging his position to open doors for young engineers from underprivileged communities with sincere humility. Brilliance has no address, Thomas told the journalist, drawing on his experience living on the streets. Wasted potential is a national tragedy, which is why we are starting a scholarship program for low-income students and former homeless individuals who want to pursue engineering. Once more, Alexander's phone rang. His old assistant, James, who was now employed by a successful startup, was there. I saw the interview, Alexander. I figured you wanted to know. Thomas Johnson is constructing a community technology center on the property where he once slept on the street. Anyone who wants to learn can take advantage of his free classes and lab access. There was a familiar weight in Alexander's chest. Thomas had transformed 3 years of agony into a life goal that would alter thousands of fates, whereas he had lost everything by making a snap judgment. There's more. He mentioned you in the interview, James added. Her encounter with discrimination, he claimed, inspired him to design methods that recognize brilliance only on the basis of ability rather than origin or look. He expressed gratitude to you for unintentionally providing him with the last push to significantly improve his profession. Alexander hung up the phone and peered out his small office window. He observed people from different walks of life passing by on the street, each with potential and tales he would never bother to learn. A LinkedIn notification vibrated on his smartphone. A year ago, I was invisible to the corporate world. Today, I use my visibility to make others visible. Thomas Johnson wrote, "The best revenge is not to destroy those who have hurt you. It is to build something greater than they could ever imagine." The post received 50,000 likes in just 2 hours. The caption included a picture of the community center that was still under construction. Alexander came to the realization that her tale had evolved into a contemporary urban legend concerning the perils of discrimination. One had lost everything by underestimating human intelligence based on appearances, but Thomas had grown to represent tenacity and social change. By proving that genuine worth is independent of pricey attire and esteemed residences, the other had gained everything. The last irony was obvious. In his attempt to devalue Thomas, Alexander had only succeeded in devaluing himself. Thomas could have won without destroying anyone. All he had to do was reveal his true self to the world. The greatest kind of retaliation has always been exceptional achievement. The capacity to remain dignified under duress, and the capacity to use injustice as motivation for constructive change. Thomas Johnson demonstrated that, although you cannot alter how other people perceive you, you can totally alter what they must perceive. If this tale of justice triumphing over hardship resonated with him, please leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever made a snap judgment based only on someone's appearance, and then come to regret it? Keep in mind that the next person you undervalue could be the one to permanently alter your course in life.